Welcome, everyone, to Best Practices for Board Leadership. If you haven't already, go ahead and say hello in the chat box and let everyone know where you're from. And thank you so much for joining today. I am Kat Long-Jones, and I am on the executive committee of the BCM. We are thrilled to have the response to our first virtual leadership focus conference. Over 130 Moravians from at least 62 different churches and or agencies have registered from 3 provinces. So from the Northern Province, Southern Province, and Eastern West Indies. It's not too late to tell friends and ministry colleagues to register by visiting moravianbcm.org as the conference runs through March 13th. We're especially glad that this year's conference is an interprovincial event co-hosted by the Board of Cooperative Ministries of the Southern Province and the Healthier Congregations Task Force of the Northern Province. You're currently muted, but you'll have an opportunity to share soon. The presentation will be in 3 parts. So you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and have those answered at 3 different opportunities during the presentation. If you have comments or questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat box, and Marie and David will answer those as soon as they are able to get to them. Our presenters today are Marie Couts, Director of Christian Education Ministry of the Eastern District and the Northern Province, and the Reverend David Guthrie from the Provincial Elders Conference in the Southern Province. And now I'm turning it over to David.
Could you please unmute yourself?
Yes, I'll do that. Thank you. This will probably be the 3rd or 4th time I need to do that today, but that's okay. Yeah, I'm David. I might change my name to you're on mute, but I was just saying I was a pastor in Florida for about 17 years in congregations, and then I moved into the Board of Evangelism and Home Mission and sort of oversaw lots of things about church life. And then for the past few years, I've been with the Provincial Elders Conference. So I've seen congregational life and leadership from a variety of perspectives. I'll let Marie say a little bit about herself.
I'm Marie Couts, and I am currently, actually for the last 16 years, I've been serving as Director of Christian Education for the Eastern District of the Northern Province. And prior to that, I was a licensed lay pastor of the Fries Valley Moravian Church. And then I'd served 9 years with the late Reverend Al Frank in Dover, Ohio, as a parish assistant. So I have seen church leadership in a variety of ways as well. And in my portfolio as Director of Christian Education is to do joint board training. So I'm thrilled to be part of this.
This workshop is actually was the original idea for Leadership Focus. Years ago, Bob Hunter, the assistant to the PEC president, did a workshop for leaders every January. It was a half-day workshop, and then around that, Leadership Focus was built. So we're kind of the old original event that you didn't know you signed up for something that was so historic, but there it is. So we want to talk about leadership in various ways, and we're just going to jump in. Again, we've got about 3 segments. We're going to pause at the end of those and then take questions around the topics that we've just covered, so you'll have like 3 rounds of information here. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, I think, the first part, we're going to be talking about board leadership in general. And I know some of you are members of boards, some of you are chair people of boards, because I see some pastors out there, but we're going to be talking about it in some sort of general ways, and then we're going to narrow down on some other things. So I like to talk about the who and the what, or the what and the who of leadership. Jeffrey Jones, a United Methodist pastor, wrote a book a few years ago that was very helpful to me in this regard, and so we're going to talk a little bit about the what and the who of leadership. This is the what of leadership, at least the list that Jones put forward, and you look at that and say, oh my goodness, strategic planning, human personality, dynamics of change, conflict management, effective leadership roles in different settings, systems theory, organizational behavior, cultural, social dynamics, group and congregational dynamics, team and community building, biblical theological knowledge and skills. Welcome to the world of leadership in today's church. And I think it's very easy to feel overwhelmed with all of that. And you get a sense that, okay, I'm just one person. I can't know all this stuff. There's no way I can keep up with all this stuff. And then what's really disturbing is there's something always new to know. You know, they should have told us when we reached a certain age that for the rest of your life, you're going to be having to be updating your software and your passwords, you know, forever. But that's the way it is in church. There's always going to be something new to know. And what that fosters in a lot of us is kind of a sense of inadequacy. Who am I to be doing this? You know, all this stuff that I'm supposed to be managing on behalf of Christ's church. Well, the good news is that it's a team effort. You're not out there by yourself. You don't have to know all that big list of stuff I ran through. One of the things that's helpful is to know how to ask the right questions, and one of my questions is, how can I find out about that? That's one of my questions. And then being able to recruit the right people. You know, people have gifts and strengths and capacities for ministry, and part of what we do is try to, as board members, is try to find the people who have the right gifts and strengths and get them operating their stuff for the good of the church too. And then just the whole idea that leadership is shared. It's not a solo performance. It's something, especially in the Moravian Church, we'll talk more about that later, that's shared. And the who of leadership is really important. This is what I like about Jeffrey Jones's work. He says, okay, you got to think about your own spiritual life. You are a disciple of Jesus. And yes, you're helping to lead other disciples, but you really do need to tend to your own spiritual well-being, your prayer life, and balance in your life and things like that. Second area that's kind of makes up the who of leadership is your self-knowledge. You know, we need to be able to recognize our gifts and our limitations, our blind spots, maybe things that set us off or things that cause us to react in ways that aren't helpful. So just getting to know ourselves and how we function and how we're wired up is really part of that too. The other thing is, you know, we have a lot of leadership skills already, and we're using them all the time, and so we just need to be aware of that a range of gifts and strengths that we already have that we've kind of internalized and that are just part of how we do business. You know, I go into a meeting and I automatically behave in certain ways, and just being aware of that. And then we have to have a commitment to continued growth in faith and love and hope. So it's a continually growing process. We always have room to learn as leaders. So if you take the who, that's the important part, and you add to it the what, then, you know, we move into this place of maybe being a faith-filled leader. I want to talk a bit about the Moravian essentials, because this kind of ties into this whole business of what we're doing. So we think about the essentials as being in having two things: on God's part, on our part. So God creates, God redeems, God sustains or blesses us with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And our response to that is to act in faith and love and hope. So God creates, redeems, and gives us the gifts, and we take those gifts and we turn around and we respond to God in faith, love, and hope. And then another dimension of the Moravian life is really here. So there's we do all of that. We respond to God in faith, love, and hope in the area of spiritual growth or discipleship, in the area of community together as brothers and sisters in Christ. That's internal community, and then in mission, going out to serve and make a difference in the world in the name of Jesus, our Savior. And so when you think about sort of the role of a leader, we help people respond to God in faith, love, and hope, and we do it in the areas of spiritual growth, community as brothers and sisters, and mission to the world in the name of Jesus. And that's really what we're leading, is what it comes down to.
In this next section, we're going to look at some basic characteristics of board members. But I wanted to pause on this slide because this is an important phrase to remember. Words matter. And so in the church, we always need to pay attention to language that we are using. Oftentimes when we use the word called, we will think in terms of ordained pastors being called to ministry. And yet those of us serving as lay people, as board members, etc., we too have been called to service in Christ's church. And so it's this partnership that we have together as Christ's disciples. And along with that sense of continually using that word call, no matter when we ask someone to serve on a board or as a Sunday school teacher or anything, the importance of that. But the other piece of that to remember is when we want to describe what those roles are going to be, we really shouldn't use the word job. If you have documents out there that say job description, see what you can do about changing the word job to ministry description. Because I think when we emphasize those words and we recognize that we are called to service, it impacts how we carry out our role in the church. And when we're reminded that everything is ministry, then that is also going to change how we do what we do. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to look at some of the basic membership characteristics of board members. First one listed is an obvious one: regular attendance at board meetings, worship, and congregational activities. That's important in terms of setting an example and a model. Some boards even have within their bylaws that if you miss 3 consecutive meetings without just cause, you can be replaced on a board. I think that emphasizes the importance of regular attendance and being part of all of these and setting that model for congregational activities as well. Active prayer life for guidance for the pastor, for the staff, for the congregation. I have suggested to boards that it is helpful that if you have a membership book and you have picture book or whatever, cut the names and pictures out of that and then put that in a bowl, put those in a bowl and keep them on your table or someplace where you see it on a daily basis, and pull one out and be in prayer for that individual or that family. When we are in prayer for those of our congregation, I think that also helps us remember about our call to ministry. The third one probably should have been the first one: confidentiality, no after meeting meetings. Now, we used to call those the parking lot meetings, and they have kind of become the internet meetings now. But it is so important to remember the confidentiality and what takes place within our board meetings. And that if you have something that needs to be said, your words and your thoughts are important to be shared. And so it needs to be done in the meeting, and never hesitate that. And that's going to help develop that trust level within the meeting as well. And certainly pastors need to understand that that confidentiality is going to be part of that leadership. You are part of a team. You are not only part of a team with each other in your call to service, but you're also a partner with your pastor. Both together are about the ministry of the church. And when we recognize that, that takes on a whole new meaning. As a matter of fact, in the last part, which kind of is the same, where it says relationship support with the pastor and staff. Some of you from the Northern Province might remember the late Jimmy Weingarth. He was a bishop in the Moravian Church, and his calling card, so to speak, when he served as a bishop was to visit the offices of pastors. And they knew he was coming if they heard a knock on their door, and he'd stick his head in the door and say, "How is it with your soul?" Well, I think that's kind of what we're looking for here. That relationship support with your pastor and with the staff of the congregation, to check in every once in a while, whether it's a phone call or a drop-in or an email that simply says, "How are things going?" That can become a very important phrase. As we go on, we are set apart as role models, certainly by example, not by power. You serve as a board member at the pleasure of your church council who elected you. You are a role model in your behavior and also in your attendance in your congregational life. Be honest in conversations, respect each other and other viewpoints. It's okay to disagree, but let's not be disagreeable. And that kind of goes back to that one about speaking in the meeting. And so you have an important voice that needs to be heard. And so even if it is in disagreement, they need to allow each other to have that voice. Be a good listener to each other and to the congregation. You need to kind of have your thumb on the heartbeat of the congregation, because that will help you be a better board member as well. So listen to what's bubbling up within your church. Discourage anonymous comments. I have a bit to say about this one. Oftentimes as a board member, you will be approached by members of your congregation who say, well, I want to tell you something and I need you to take this to the board, but I don't want you to use my name. That has probably happened to most of you at some point in time. And my rule of thumb is that the response to that is, you need to talk to the pastor and I would be happy to go with you. You may come to a board meeting and I would be happy to have you come and I'll tell the pastor you're coming. Or I would be happy to share your comment, but I won't do it if I can't share your name. We have to help one another own our feelings and recognize that they are not right or wrong, they're real, and we need to be able to verbalize them. Who says something can make such a difference in terms of how we hear a comment. I know a situation where a pastor was criticized for not visiting someone, and the end of that story is they wanted to complain to the board, but they didn't want the person to take their name. And the end of that story was that the pastor had visited that person, but it was a confidential visit, and the pastor couldn't even share it with the board. And so simply hearing an anonymous comment can do so much harm. And so please do your part in discouraging that and simply set the bar very high. We don't do that in this house. Go along with that in the last bullet, do not participate in and discourage others from participating in gossip and rumor. In my house as a teenager, I always had some bit of juicy gossip to bring home from school. And the rule of my house was, did you hear it with your own ears? Did you see it with your own eyes? And if I had to say no, it was not to be heard in my house. So I think that setting that example for one another by how we're going to behave is such a critical role for a board member.
Yeah, I think these last 2 points for me, I think one of our jobs as a board member or a pastor is to get the topic of conversation in the right place, and out on the sidewalk or an anonymous comment or gossip, it's out there floating around, and so we move it from the informal and less productive channels into the formal channels of communication, so that something can be done about it. And so that's a lot of what's going on with those last few points. Is we're the ones who might get a piece of information, and then we need to put it in the right channel so it can be productively dealt with. And that's one way to look at that. Well, believe it or not, we've come to our first question, comment, and concern section of the program. Thank you so much. We've thrown a lot at you in just a few minutes. Everything from the what and the who and a little bit about basics of board leadership. So I think our friends in the support room are going to be giving us some of the questions that you've raised. If you have a question, you probably have time to put it in the chat if you'd like. I think that's how we're going to deal with questions tonight. So if you want to maybe ask a question or place a comment in the chat, we'll respond to those for a little bit. So. Well, we're not being overwhelmed by questions here, Marie. Maybe they're going to pile them all up to the end of the program. Maybe that's what's going to happen. So we'll give you a chance to think about what we're sharing, and maybe something along the way will spark a question or two. So I think we're going to be ready to move into this next section. So. All right, so let's talk a little bit about board meetings. And notice how we spelled it the right way. It's not B-O-R-E-D, it's B-O-A-R-D. I just wanted to point that out. We corrected that. It was misspelled earlier, but we're just going to go through some points. And in the handouts, there's a thing called best practices, which deals with a lot of these things. But what Marie and I discovered was, as we were preparing for this, is this stuff is very much alike in both provinces. I mean, it just really is. So, one of the ways to make it more about sort of the agenda or the business of the church is to make sure that you get a chance to share your faith story with one another. And oftentimes some of that stuff's a little bit of surprise, but so get people to talk about how they came to be a Christian, who led them to know Jesus, or an important faith event that they've experienced in their life. Marie wants to chime in, I think, so, yeah.
Just a quick comment on that one. One of the things to remember on that first question is, I have been in many board meetings where sometimes the opening faith sharing question is, where did you see Jesus today? And that type. I have found that, and keeping in mind that in our board, we always have different types of personalities, and some are introverts and some are extroverts. The introverts really like to know those questions are going to be asked ahead of time. So it's nice if you can put that opening faith sharing question in your agenda. But also, I have found that it is much easier for a person to share their faith story by asking them, who introduced you to Jesus? I actually have had to set time limits on how much time they take to share that, because there's always these wonderful stories of a grandparent or a neighbor or a parent. And that's an easy faith sharing story. It can be a little more difficult for someone to identify where they saw Jesus today, not knowing what you were looking for. So that's, in terms of bringing board members on with sharing of their faith, this is a very good one to start with, because just about everyone has a response to that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Marie. It's really helpful to have materials out in advance of the meeting, and we're talking about several days. So that people have a chance to look it over, read materials, if there's memos or explanations or detailed stuff that needs to be looked at. And so part of our job is to be able to read those materials and really try to be as ready as we can for the meeting, so that we're not having to have something brand new introduced and then have to talk about it, explain it, and then maybe make a decision all in the same meeting. So that's one tip. The other thing is, sometimes it's good to look back and say, okay, what maybe you call it matters arising. So so we have the minutes from the last meeting, and there were 4 things that David Guthrie was supposed to do, and David says, well, I did this, I didn't do that, and I should have done that, and so you just have a way to check in on what's gone on, and then it's not only what you were deciding, but also what's happened since the last time we were together, and are there things that we need to be aware of, and that's important to talk about. This is a great idea. I'm going to let Marie talk about it because it's hers. Yeah.
I have found that we generally have board meetings in the same room every time, whether it's a board meeting room in your church or a fellowship hall, and we kind of stay there. I have found it helpful if boards will go throughout the church and meet in different rooms, because then you can look around the rooms. And this is especially true for trustees in terms of, look at the peeling paint, noticing the facilities needs, but also for elders in terms of what ministries are happening in this room. And is it appropriate? Is there enough space? Oftentimes you can be in a classroom of first graders and recognize that you're sitting at adult tables in those rooms, and then try to imagine how that would be for a little first grader who had to sit up that big table. So a lot of good can come from having our board members recognizing. So meet everywhere, from the balcony to the choir room to the Sunday school rooms, and work your way throughout the church, and then kind of ask yourselves, what's happening in these rooms and what do they say about the ministry that takes place here? David, you're muted.
There we go. Good. Well, Moravians are conferential decision makers, and what it basically means is we talk with each other as we make decisions. So board members talk with one another. If you have trustees and elders, they should be talking with each other about decision making. We seek input from congregation committees, so like the CE committee or the music and worship committee or the missions committee. We're in conversation with them. And we're in conversation with the members and the people that are going to be affected by our decisions. Now, this slows everything down, but we Moravians value relationships quite a bit. And so this conferring with one another as we come to decisions, even if the board has the authority and is going to make the final decision, is so important. And everybody on the board should have opportunity to share their thoughts and ideas. Not all of us are extroverts. Not all of us are quick studies. And so you wind up, oftentimes this is the chair's job, is to say, hey, wait a minute. There's some folks in the room we haven't heard from on this. Marie, what do you think about this? I hate to put you on the spot, but would you please share your thoughts? Or do any of you who haven't spoken so far would like to have a moment to share? Or one of the techniques I used with a pretty shy board one time, church board, was have people write stuff down and then hand it to me, and then I could read it, and they weren't embarrassed having to open their mouth and say it themselves, although I did identify them, but that was just kind of a subtle way to get people, communicating in whatever channels you can. So, yeah. Let's see if I can get this slide to change. There we go. Another thing I'll chat about is in the South, in some places we use consensus decision making. We use this at synod committees. We recommend this lots of times. And you may know there's different positions. They call it the 5-finger positions or whatever. So you have a range of stuff where I'm completely for this and I'm ready to go out and get to work on it today, to I'm against this and I cannot stand aside. And then, well, I like it, but I wish it would change a little bit. Well, I really don't like it, but I'll support whatever the group wants to do. I don't like this, but maybe if a few things changed, I could like it. So you have all these ranges, and if you kind of let that play out in your board meeting, you get to see all the different viewpoints. It's not just yes, no, vote. We voted 5-4 to do this. Well, it doesn't tell you what the range of views is. And so as long as no one doesn't object, you can still move things forward using that kind of decision-making model. It surprises people. I tell people, the PEC here in the South, we make almost all of our decisions by consensus. The only time we really take a vote and record it is when it's some kind of official action that requires us to tell somebody that the PEC voted and approved this. So, but that's important. So I'll let Marie talk about some of these other ones. So.
Well, the consensus decision making, just a comment on that, and that is, oftentimes we think that consensus means that we all have to reach the point where everybody's nodding yes to this. And the truth is, if you kind of image, say, 5 or 6 squares on a floor, and what David said, up here is I love this idea, and over here is kill me now, then in between you have these different viewpoints. So it might be that you have to say to someone, well, what would it take for you to move over here, where you're not voting against it or saying no to it, but rather you want to negotiate how this is going to play out. And so it's a wonderful, wonderful way to encourage conversation as well as negotiating in a board.
I'll tell a story. It happened just recently. The PEC was trying to make a decision via email, and 6 of us were heading in a particular direction, and we waited to hear from our 7th person, and that person came out with I'm really not in favor of this, and here's why. And within a 24-hour period, we all came around to the position of we're really not in favor of this, and here's why. And we headed off in a different direction. So that's the power of taking the sort of scanning the room and seeing where people are, because sometimes that one person, the Holy Spirit's really speaking through them, and everybody else needs to listen and say, you know what? We really don't need to do this. We need to come up with something better, and then that's what happens. So, yeah. I think what's really important is once a decision is made, it becomes everybody's decision. We're a team. You're the team. The board is a team. If you can't walk out of the meeting room and speak with one voice, then you probably got some more work to do. And so that's the real challenge, is that we got to get to a place where we can go out and and talk to others about our decisions and say, yes, the board decided. It wasn't, well, the PEC decided 4-3 to do this, and I was one of the ones who didn't want to do it. But anyway, I'm going to tell you what we're doing. That's not the best way to announce a decision. The board has decided we're doing this. So yeah. What's really important is the discussions around decisions need to be confidential. So you don't go out and talk to people about something that has not been decided. Or if you're in the middle of deciding something, you certainly don't go out and say, tell people that, what people's views are or how the discussion is going until the decision is reached. You don't really talk about those things. And then once the decision is made, I say you don't let people pick you apart. Well, how many of you were in favor of it, and how many of you were against it? And that's just picking you apart. You don't let that happen. I'm going to let you talk a little bit about this last one, Marie, because it's kind of your specialty. So
well, this one actually leads us right into the next slide and the next segment, which is the use of a consent agenda. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but my personal experience has been, here's the way most board meetings go. You come into the board meeting, you have the opening devotions, then you have the pastor's report, and then you have the treasurer's report, and then you have the reading of the minutes, and then you have the reports from any of the liaison committees that you might have to report on. And oftentimes what happens is you'll say, well, does anybody approve the minutes? And the truth is, well, I didn't read those yet. So then we take time, and then we sit in the quiet while some people read the minutes. And so by the time all of that is taken care of, we are now into a big chunk of meeting time. And at that point, we're looking at a new business agenda, and people are just saying ready to go home because most of the meeting time has been taken up on reports, etc. So a consent agenda is designed to help a board focus on the important future pieces of an agenda without making people feel fatigued before you ever get to that point. So here's how this would work. You're going to have two pieces to your agenda. You have the consent agenda, and then you will have a discussion agenda. So in your pre-meeting, and this is important, before the meeting, before your board meeting, all financial, staff, committee reports are sent out in advance, at least a week to 2 weeks. And then take a highlighter or underscore anything, any proposed board action that is needed at the top of each committee report. An example, if you are a liaison to a Christian education committee, and that Christian education committee has a report, you have this typed and ready to go, but within that report, the Christian education committee would like approval to take a Sunday school class on a trip. That needs to be discussed. And so you would highlight that, and that goes into a separate section. So then the consent agenda has your tentative meeting agenda, your minutes, your reports, your correspondence, etc. Any routine approval of baptisms, weddings, confirmation. That is all part of a consent agenda. Okay, next slide. So what happens after that then? At the meeting, the chairperson would say, you have all received the board packet with the consent agenda. Does anyone wish to move an item from the consent agenda to the discussion agenda? Now, it's helpful if you do this ahead of time, if you've read through your reports, and so the chairperson is aware of this, but it can be done at the meeting. This isn't something that you take a vote on. It's not discussed. If any member wants to take something from a consent agenda and move it to a discussion agenda, it goes. Then the chair says, okay, without discussion, the consent agenda is ready for a vote. All those in favor, all those opposed, and all items on that consent agenda, the pastor's report, the treasurer's report, the approval of baptisms, all of those pieces are approved in one fell swoop. You have just done a big chunk of meeting time into a very small piece of time. Now, The next then comes your discussion agenda. The discussion agenda should hold perhaps 1 to 3 items that got anything, plus anything that was moved out of, like that CEC section. You don't have to keep the whole report to go to the discussion agenda, but only that part that was highlighted where the Sunday school class wanted to go somewhere. So those pieces would be moved to the consent agenda. I'm sorry, to the discussion agenda. And those items then become the heart of the meeting. An example would be, what are our ministry priorities if we go forward? How well are we doing with our mission? Those are just examples. But the point of this is, when we can shorten the business end of our meeting, we now have time to vision, to dream, to listen to what God is calling us to do and be in the future. And meetings become more exciting, etc. The next slide will kind of identify some of the benefits of this. The board will pay attention to what's most important. Board members are motivated to read and understand that board packet because it must be read ahead of time. Attendance will improve and meetings are more interesting and satisfying because we have an opportunity to dream and vision and listen to where God is calling us. Now, a few caveats to this. First of all, the only way this works is that those receiving that pre-meeting packet for the consent agenda must be committed and covenant with one another that you will read every item, because those reports are important. Those pastors' reports, the agency reports, all of those things are very important. And so we have to be committed to reading those ahead of time. I have found that it takes about 6 months for a church who wants to try this. It takes 6 months to live into this because we are not used to this. We are used to looking over the minutes at the meeting. We are not used to getting these reports out early. It takes a long time to get into the process. So after a month, if you're just kind of frustrated, you want to try this, and after a month, you're just getting frustrated, you think, let's go back to the old way, give it 6 months, because I have found that that's how long it takes to really get this into play. And for the churches that have put this into play, they really have seen the benefit, and they have found that ministries, new ministries, are developed more often because of this. I have at the bottom there where the source for this, Governance and Ministry, Rethinking Board Leadership by Dan Hotchkiss. He was with Alban Institute, and it's a wonderful book. And this is where a lot of this comes from. And within that book, you will be able to get more details about this as well.
And we come into our second docking station for taking the questions or comments or things you want to raise for the group. So let me see if we have some questions popping up in the chat. Here's one I'll try to field. Most meetings get oral reports rather than written. How to make this change? Agree by consensus or vote? Yeah, I think introducing it, Marie's done more of that, but really you have to kind of talk people through how this works. And the way I've done it is you start off with really simple stuff. And then you build, over time you can build the consent agenda once people get the hang of it. The only thing on the consent agenda was the minutes. That meant I was supposed to read the minutes before the meeting. Oh, you didn't read the minutes before the meeting? Well, then we're going to postpone the approval of these minutes until our next meeting. But next meeting, you will need to read the minutes. And you come to the next meeting, now you got 2 sets of minutes on the agenda, and everybody's read them, so you approve them. And so you can kind of ease into it. But I think you have to kind of introduce the concept, and like Marie had the selling points for it, really talk to people about the benefits of it. That this kind of clears the deck, it takes care of the routine stuff, it allows us to not dwell on reports that don't need too much attention, it allows us to focus on the key points. You try to sell it to people. So that's a little bit about how I would think about doing that, Carol. Chris Johnson also is commenting, I see. Yeah, no, I'm finally getting to the comments here. Okay, yeah. Great. Are you seeing those, Marie? You want to take a stab at the next one? Aaron's comment.
I'm not seeing them. So
Okay. It says, maybe not for this moment, but what are some of the ways to deal with the challenges of member allowing their name to stand for election to the board? Boy, that's a big topic. Yeah, I assume you might mean people allowing themselves to be nominated to the board, or maybe they allow themselves to be nominated from the floor in the meeting. I don't know what's behind the question. Maybe it's they're not qualified, or they shouldn't be standing for election. I'm not sure exactly what's behind that, but
yeah, it's the question of letting their name stand as a nomination to be elected to the board, whether it be beforehand, church council, yada yada yada.
Yeah, I think one of the things
the people filling positions.
Yeah,
things.
I think one of the things, two things. If you emphasize the role of your nominating committee, in other words, let people know we have a nominating committee that's made up of these people and they are preparing a slate of nominees. If you're interested in becoming a nominee, talk to them, but they are the ones who are going to discern and decide who's going to be on the ballot. And so you promote the nominating committee, and you let the nominating committee do its job without interference. That's one thing to do, so that it's not it's defined, it has a roles and responsibilities, it has a process it's following, and you make that very transparent in the congregation so they understand, oh, we've got a group that's helping us shape the ballot. The second thing is, be very clear about the role and expectations of board members up front, and tell it like it is, and you may be thinking about being a board member. Well, here are the cold hard facts about what board leadership means, and as you pray and think about this, consider whether you have the gifts and strengths to carry this through, and so you sort of challenge people with the job description, but really, ideally the nominating team will be strong enough that they will help sort that out if somebody's putting their name in nomination and maybe not qualified, or allowing their name to stand when everybody knows they're not going to be terribly active if they got elected or something like that. So okay, we do need to move ahead. We've got several new questions here. This question from Megan: how do the dynamics of unified versus traditional board differ?
Megan, are you talking about a unified board being where we combine the elders and trustees into one board?
Yes. Many of our smaller churches are going to a single board as opposed to the traditional two boards. And then the question becomes, well, do we elect members as board members and they then divide up who's going to do what, or do we elect them as trustees and elders? Because that's the way you have to turn it in on the annual report. I just think there are some differences that can cause problems for either going from one to the other, or from the past. Is just the pastor chairs the board of elders, but not the board of trustees. What do you do when you have a unified board?
Yeah, I think what I'll say initially is you need to follow your rules and regulations. So I don't think you can elect people generally to the board and then have them divide up into elders and trustees, unless that's what your rules and regulations say. I know Marie has some ideas about the unified board. I can maybe talk about some of the downsides of having two separate boards, but Marie, you may want to chime in here.
We've had a lot of requests for that in the Eastern District. And so David is right, even for the Northern Province, because the first step in moving to a unified board is to request a bylaw change, because that it must be within the bylaw that's how we're going to function. Then I've developed parts of my workshops to address this, and part of that is in developing a ministry description for a unified board. And you're right, Megan, there are options and ways to do that, but I have found that it is not beneficial to elect someone with the mindset of, well, these people can be the elders and these people can be the trustees. It's just going to have to take a complete change of vision on our part in terms of we're electing people to serve as one board. It's a unified board. And so that wording becomes very important. And then you can develop your agenda accordingly. I'm afraid that it gets into a little more than probably we have time for tonight, but I would be happy to send to anyone my documents on that, as well as the ministry description for that, because that really has become a very important part in the Eastern District as our churches are growing smaller.
Yeah, I'll take the next two questions, I think. So Carol comments that some churches have formed a committee to pray for the board and pastors, and I guess the committee requires written questions or criticisms or information. I assume they gather stuff from the congregation. Just right out of the gate, I may not be understanding the question, but that doesn't seem too healthy to me. I think if you want to hold that and come back, we're going to spend some time in our last segment talking about this area of board leadership, and maybe then we can kind of circle back and talk about that. Beth mentions you can pray for the ministries that are happening in the various places that you're sitting in when you have the meetings. That's a wonderful idea. And then Mike Wood says, well, gosh, in city government, the consent agenda was used to ramrod things through the council when nobody was paying attention. And the way you stop that in the church is you really do hit the pause button on the consent agenda at the beginning of the meeting, and you say, all right, the assumption is you all read these things. If you're surprised by something, or if you disagree with something, or if you think we need to actually talk about one of these things, now is the time that it's no problem. All you have to say is, I want the youth activity center decision. I want it moved into the discussion agenda. Nobody's going to argue with you. Nobody's going to talk you out of it. Everyone has the privilege of moving whatever item they want to move to the discussion to discussion. Here's your chance. Don't let it go by. And you really try to tap into the seriousness of, this is the consent agenda that we assume we all agree with. If that's not the case, feel free to move it over to discussion and we'll discuss it. And we do this at PEC all the time, and probably every third or fourth meeting, somebody pulls something from the consent agenda. And I think, why in the world are they doing that? And then later on, I realize, oh, that's why they were doing that, so. Okay, yeah. I think maybe we've run through the questions, at least for this section. Let me see if that's true. I think we have, Hannah, so thank you for gathering those. We're going to go ahead and move into our third round, and then we'll have probably a little bit more time at the end to get involved in some further back and forth in Q&A. So thank you so much. We'll be pushing ahead even now.
Communication. If this slide were bigger, I would have typed that word even more often. Poor communication tends to be the biggest reason for conflict within a congregation. We can't have too much communication, and so the sharing of information is critically important on the part of boards with the congregation. And one way in which we can carry that out is to hold town hall meetings. Now, town hall meetings will improve that transparency, and what they are is quarterly gatherings of a congregation for sharing and conversation with the joint board. Now, there are some things we need to remember what they aren't. This is just kind of considered a regular huddle time. Quarterly gatherings. We're always more informal when we're eating, so a covered dish dinner following worship, or a dessert table, or just coffee and cookies, but people seated at a table. And this is the most important piece to remember. Town hall meetings should never be held during a time of congregational conflict or crisis, because you already know what's going to happen in that kind of setting. But what this is an opportunity for board members to share with the congregation what is happening. So the board would be seated at the front of the gathering, and that someone from elders and trustees would share, this is what we've been doing. Here's what's going on. Here's what decisions we've made recently. Here's what we're planning. Then as we move on, we can ask simple questions, which then guide the overall gathering, because now these board members say to the congregation, how do you think we're doing? This isn't where they're going to tell you you're bad board members. This is, how are you feeling about the decisions that have been made, about the things that are going on? Because the concern on the part of the board is for the clergy and boards and congregation. It's all three. So you ask the congregation, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And this is where you as board members need to have excellent listening skills, because from nuanced items to specific things that are shared, you want to get a grip on what's bubbling up from the congregation. We're telling them, here's what's coming up. Here's what we've been doing so far. What do y'all think? What's happening in our congregation that we need to be aware of? So this is give and take information sharing. There are no elections. There's no action that is taken. There's no voting that happens. This is just a family gathering together for a family meeting of sharing. And in the very first one that you hold, you need to remember that if it starts to go out of into areas of conflict or something, you need to stop that, because if anything happens at that very first gathering, you're not going to get a second one. So you can move on, David, to the next one. And that was in our next slide. You're going to, oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to, one more comment on the communication on the town hall meetings. I have found that congregations that have implemented this, what happens is oftentimes when congregations don't have the answers, they make them up or they fill in their own blanks. And what happens then is things get blown out of proportion, or we don't have accuracy out there. The town hall meetings take care of that, because you are sharing with them what's going on, and they are sharing with you what they're hearing, what they're feeling. So everybody has the same information. And the congregations that have put this into place and have used this have found that it has really helped the morale of the congregation, as well as taking care of that communication issue. Oh, Dave, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. Well, I'm going to jump in with Carol's question. Also, Chris, I'm going to, at the end, I'll maybe say something about consensus decision-making resources. But Carol says, how do you keep a town hall meeting from turning into a gripe session? And I think one of the things that you do is you have to frame the conversation. Basically, you create a behavioral covenant. You explain what a town hall meeting is before they ever get to it. And you remind people at the beginning what this is for. This is for information. It's for sharing. It's not for deciding. It's not for arguing. It's not for, complaining about things that you need to address to the trustees. And, that's not what it's about. It's about sharing information and listening to each other. So you kind of frame it that way. And then, quite frankly, you have to be ready. Somebody has to be ready to be the policeman. And if things go off the rails, because you've told them in advance what a town hall meeting is and what it isn't, and you've reminded them at the beginning of the meeting, then when David starts hollering and screaming about the plumbing or whatever, you can say, time out. We all agreed before we got here that this was not what a town hall meeting was about. I appreciate your concern. You can take it outside. I'll talk to you privately later, but right now we're talking on information sharing and trying to listen to each other about what's best for the church. So you basically have to be frame it and then be willing to police it is the way to kind of deal with that. You don't need to have bouncers, but you need to have somebody ready to stand up and say, wait a minute, you're not doing what we said, that kind of thing. So, okay.
Also a wonderful opportunity for you to say, please come to our next elder or trustee meeting, kind of keep
Yeah.
that line of communication open too.
Yeah, it's perfect. That sounds like something you need to bring to the elders. How about talking to me after the meeting, and maybe you can come to our meeting, and we'll be glad to talk to you about how upset you are about the Sunday school materials, that kind of thing. So yeah, okay, good. A listening board. And so sometimes you can just have sort of a drop-in session that, okay, after church today, David and Marie are going to be in the parlor and just ready to answer questions or follow up on anything that you want to talk about. Your elders are available for you today. Board members can move around and sit in different places and get to know different people in the congregation. The 3-minute rule, don't talk to somebody you know well. Talk to people you don't know so well. Let me give you a tip on this, because people are embarrassed. I've been coming to church. I sit next to Marie, or no, I see Marie, and to be honest, I don't know whether she's a newcomer or whether she's been a member for 12 years. And so, guess what? I'm not going to say anything to Marie, because if I get it wrong, oh, are you new here? So the way you get around that is you say, Marie, how long have you been part of New Philadelphia Church? She says, I just walked in the door. You say, whew, she's a newcomer. She says, well, my grandma brought me here when I was 2. Oh, that long. I know I've seen you, but I haven't spoken to you. You've been a member for 62 years. So that's the end. You say, how long have you been associated with the church? It's a neutral way of not embarrassing yourself. That's part of the 3-minute rule. Maybe Marie, you can talk about these next couple things too. So.
This is for elders to set a group of families that you contact in. And I know that a number of churches do this. I think there's different wording that they use for this, sometimes shepherding. And so it's just an opportunity to have that regular contact with your families and your members of your congregation, just to share news or information, to answer any questions, to ask for a prayer. So an elder of the week or the month is also a way to be in contact with, in addition to the pastor, so that's kind of shared leadership. Mm-hmm. So that can be shared through the bulletins. David?
I put in this last one at my dad's church. I almost laughed out loud because I went with him to church one day and I looked in the rack in front of me and here are these cards and you pull it out and there is literally a person in a cage, like a little drawing of a person in a cage, and the card said, rattle our cage. And then you could write down whatever you needed to write down and put it in the offering plate. It was rattle the staff's cage. And they literally had a picture of a person, in a cage. And I thought, but that's another communication tool, is get people to drop those notes in the offering plate about whatever's on their mind. But then guess what the corollary to that is? You better follow up. Because if I turn in a card about the radiator in the men's Bible class that doesn't work anymore 4 times in a row, and the trustees don't fix it, then I think you get what I'm getting at there.
And make sure they put their names to their items.
Yes, exactly, yeah. But those are useful ways. Okay, we're going to move into a different direction, and Marie, I'm excited about this because Marie has really brought this to my attention, and so we want to spend some time talking about a mutual covenant. This is where we're going to kind of pick up on what you were asking earlier, Carol, about the committee that somehow relates to the pastor. Yeah. So.
One of the things that I have found is that when a pastor accepts a call, the pastor and the board have a certain amount of information that has been shared. But after a period of time, another board is in place or new members are in place and they don't know why that pastor was called. So I came up with a process called a mutual covenant. And the pastor, in this, we acknowledge that the pastor is called to service through the mutual agreement of the congregation, the district executive board, and the Provincial Elders Conference, with the terms of the pastor's call outlined in the letter of call and the Moravian Church Book of Order. The pastor's acceptance of the call then constitutes an agreement between those 3 entities and the pastor. But what can happen is that after a period of time, then we don't remember what that discussion took place. So we have in this flow chart, I hopefully will have made it more understandable. We have the congregational self-evaluation. I think in the Southern Province, that's called a congregational profile. And so that with the ministry dialogue where the pastor visits the church, then with the joint board, then they have this conversation. And the pastor is given the results of that congregational or profile. And so the pastor knows going in what that congregation is looking for. And when the PEC and district board issued that call, it was with the hope that that pastor has the gifts that is needed for the ministry of that church. So then, in the best possible way, the pastor and the joint board then come together and they develop a mutual covenant. And the mutual covenant then is a piece that can be reviewed annually by the pastor and the joint board. Now, here's how the mutual covenant comes into play. Go to the next slide. The mutual covenant then would become a listing of agreed upon goals and expectations of both the joint board and the pastor for your particular church. A mutual covenant between the pastor and joint board will then be drafted by the pastor and the joint board. And this document will be developed primarily on the results of the congregational self-assessment or profile, the call process dialogue session with the pastor, and 3 to 5 goals that the pastor hopes to achieve in the first 12 months or the next 12 months, depending on whether this is a new pastorate or an ongoing. And the ministry goals then can be reviewed and evaluated and updated as needed on an annual basis. Now, why I like this is oftentimes congregations want to evaluate. They want to evaluate the pastor. They want to evaluate the ministries, etc. This gives context to that. It helps us see that together we came up with these particular goals. And at the end of that year time, when we come back and review this, then we can say, what did we do? How did we, because this is partnership, how did we do with these? Do we need to tweak them? Were they really needed? Do we want to place new ones for the next year? And so that wonderful conversation then becomes part of that dreaming and visioning piece in our board meetings, as well as developing and evaluating the direction and goals of the congregation. Now, that is a simple way, but I think it would allow for a really beneficial conversation between the boards and the pastor as you look at the ministry of the congregation as a whole.
Yeah, and I think what's good to emphasize here, it is a mutual covenant. And so it involves things that the board members are agreeing to do. It includes the things that the pastor is going to be working on. It also includes things that there's shared responsibility between the board and pastor. But it really is, these are the things that we're working on, and we're going to hold each other accountable for their accomplishment for the good of the church. So it's not a to-do list for the pastor. It really is a mutual covenant. Yeah. Well, we're going to move into kind of our final run here, and Marie's going to be helping us work through some of this stuff as well. So thanks, Marie.
This one has to do with the staffing in our congregations, or whether they're paid or appointed staff relations. And so we need to have some manner in which oftentimes we become reactive rather than proactive. And the only time we really address the staff relations has to do if a problem has surfaced or if we have a conflict that has come along. And so looking at paid and appointed staff relations committee, the thing to remember here is in all of the roles, whether it is the administrative assistant, the music director, the janitor, whatever, develop ministry descriptions for these individuals, helping them understand that their role in the congregation is also a ministry, not a job, which we have tended to apply to these positions. And so to avoid waiting until a conflict, if we can address this by establishing a staff relations committee, we now have a way to address things before they become blown out of proportion. So the purpose of a staff relations committee will be to support and review the ministries of the paid appointed staff, to develop positive lines of communication among the staff, to assist when needed with interpersonal congregational conflict, and to encourage partnership and joy in serving our Lord Jesus Christ. So how this would work, you would develop the paid appointed staff relations committee, and they will review the ministry of the administrative assistant, secretary, janitor, sexton, music director, and any other paid or appointed staff on an annual basis. You would develop, this staff relations committee would develop self-evaluation forms that would then be given to the paid staff and then reviewed on this yearly evaluation. Then staff will be encouraged to contact the chair of the staff relations committee if ever a conflict or problem arises. But what happens is when you're meeting annually with them for these evaluations, then you can enter into conversation where they might share a concern before it becomes an area of conflict. So the staff relations committee then would be accountable to the joint board. And how this would be formulated would be paid staff, next slide, David. The staff relations committee would be the paid appointed staff relations committee would be comprised of one member of the board of elders, one member of the board of trustees, and one member of the congregation appointed by the joint board. And that person will be the chairperson of the staff relations committee. The term of service for the board members will be concurrent with whatever their term of service is on their board that they serve. And the chairperson would be appointed to a 3-year term renewable. This isn't something that's going to meet monthly. This isn't something that even needs to be quarterly unless an issue arises where we need to come together because some member of the staff has brought a concern to the staff relations committee chairperson. But this can really develop a wonderful working partnership with all staff and help them understand that their ministry is critical to the whole life of the congregation. And the more steps we can take to avoid conflict before it ever surfaces, the better for the whole church.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my microphone. The one thing I'll add here is, some of the stuff we've talked about may seem pretty big for our smaller churches. And one of the things Marie and I were conversing about this was, so we just described the staff relations committee. It may not be possible to have a staff relations committee when you have a church that has 35 people at worship. But what you can do is think about that function, and maybe 1 or 2 people can take on that role rather than having a full-blown committee, or it can be a subgroup of the joint board, 1 elder and 1 trustee. So there's ways to kind of scale this a little bit if you're beginning to feel overwhelmed about some of these things. I think we are at the point of our next round of questions and comments, and let's see if we have some coming in the door. Carol is asking, what's the pastor's role in relationship to the staff relations committee?
Well, I think first of all to remember that any time in the church, we always want to encourage, whether this is a board member that you're hearing something in worship from someone or from a staff member. First of all, we would want to encourage those individuals to go talk to the pastor, okay? Because a lot of these things don't need a committee to address. Sometimes it's just a personal conflict issue that can be talked out. And so that would be my first response to that. But if that doesn't solve it, it is helpful, I think, to have the staff relations committee not include the pastor, because it keeps the pastor in that role of intermediary rather than getting into the thick of things. So that's just a personal opinion on that. David?
Yeah, I think I don't have anything to disagree with about what Marie just said. I think it's I think the real challenge in some churches is that you may have to build a certain level of trust in the leadership system and in the membership for a pastor staff relations committee to function well, because there just seems to be a lot of defensiveness or anxiety about talking about ministry or how we're doing or what our needs are. Some pastors and some staff are reluctant to voice concerns directly to a group like this, and so you really underlying this is kind of finding ways to build some trust among the folks that are involved. Yeah, good point is, what if there's a problem between the pastor and a staff member? Yeah, Marie might have a point on that one.
We have a point on that, and that is, if we're looking at the staff relations committee, that one is primarily designed for the evaluation of the paid and hired staff. However, I do have a program or a document for a grievance policy for congregations. And part of that process would cover what you're addressing and questioning, Carol, because every bit of this is a learning curve. We really aren't used to dealing with things up front and with the individuals with whom it's needed. And so oftentimes we've got to do this step by step with our congregations and help them understand that it's okay to have conflict, and it's okay as long as we go to the right person and deal with it in the right way. So within that grievance policy and procedures that I've developed, and I would highlight just very quickly that for Moravians, I had a congregation come to me once and ask me to develop a grievance policy. Well, my answer to that is we have a grievance policy, and it's in the book Covenant for Christian Living and the Ground of the Unity. And you can pick the pieces out of that, and that's our policy. Now, procedures for conflict is another matter. And so that might then necessitate that this staff relations committee also get involved in some of those pieces. But that's another step in the process, Carol, and bit by bit. It's all about modeling and encouraging people to be open and honest with their feelings.
Well, Hannah has done such a great job tracking questions so far. The only outstanding question she's aware of is the one about, is there a resource about consensus decision making? And the answer is yes, Chris, but I can't put my fingers on it right now. What I'm going to try to do is see if we can get this material out to the group who participated, because we did hit that pretty hard. The Southern Province Synod of 2018 used consensus decision-making in our committees, and there's a fairly easy 2-page explanation that really works pretty well that they developed. And then there are a couple of other resources that I have in my files that are electronic files that I'll be glad to put out there for you. But if you wanted to, any of you wanted to, chime in with me privately via email to get those things. But I made a note, and what we'll do is try to get that out to everybody. But it's the materials that were developed at our synod do a pretty good job of explaining it, and also give a little process outline for how you implement it. So yeah.
And I have a couple documents on that as well, and the one is titled Gradients of Agreement, and so as well as consensus making. So I'd be happy to share those as well too.
Yeah. Well, it is time to open it up for all of the burning questions you've been saving up to the end of the meeting. You've been there before as a board member. You're walking out of the meeting, and someone says at the last minute, "Oh, by the way," and so here's your "oh, by the way" chance. So please take advantage of it. Well, Marie, do you have any, closing comments before we wrap things up tonight?
It's our final slide is my last comment.
Thank you for reminding me. I'll see if I can make it appear.
This is probably my favorite part of any meeting. Now, all I'm going to do tonight is tell you about it, because we have too many people to actually do this, unless you want to be here till about 10 or 11. But at the end, I encourage you to implement this into any meeting that you lead. And this is at the end of the meeting, after all business is cared for and before your closing prayer, we're going to do what I call around the table, although for the last year I've had to do around the screen. And what this is oftentimes, and I do Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. And what I have found is that the one that impacts our board work the most is between an extrovert and an introvert. The introverts are those who drive home from the meeting saying, oh, I wish I would have said that, or think about what they wanted to say long after the agenda item has moved on. When you close your meeting by saying, okay, we're going to do once around the table, this isn't where you say, anybody have a final comment? We're going to go person to person around the table. Now, it is okay for them to say, I'm hungry and want to go home, and it's okay for them to say pass. But when you call on each person has the opportunity to speak to anything at all, including the very first item on the agenda. And what I have found is the introverts are the ones who will say, oh, I wanted to say on item B. As a matter of fact, I just had a meeting 4 days ago, and I hadn't done this for a while, but I closed the meeting doing the around the table. And one of the participants in the meeting said, oh, I'm so glad I get a chance. I've been wanting to say this, but I know that this is past due, but, and she addressed something that had happened very early in the meeting. What she had to say was invaluable. It was a voice that really we needed to hear, but she had to come to the point where she could say it and think about it because she indeed was an introvert. And you will find that to be true. So if you close every meeting with around the table, you're going to find that you might get some really, really valuable comments from people. So something to try.
I see that Hannah has let us know in the chat that you will be getting resources not only for this workshop, but access to some others from other things at Leadership Focus. And she gives you an opportunity to sign up for the BCM news if you're not doing that. It typically comes out on Tuesdays, I think, and it has a wealth of information. I know even it includes a bunch of stuff, and so you'll want to check that out. And we've been really delighted that the Healthy Congregations folks in the North have joined in helping this Leadership Focus be so successful. I think we kind of broke the interprovincial barrier or something. Just COVID has done that for us. Isn't it wonderful? We can be together and again, I just want to say I was amazed in working with Marie about how much we have in common. She would say something, I say, oh yeah, we do that down here, or we need to do that down here. I'd say, well, what about this? She says, oh yeah, we do that up here. And so it was just a wonderful experience to share with her for this workshop. Here's a question from Brenda. What are your thoughts on spiritual development of board members? What percentage of time do you recommend should be spent on this during a board meeting? If I knew how to do it, I'd go back to the beginning of the slideshow where we had the 3 circles: spiritual growth, community, and mission. And if you think about it, those circles were balanced. But what often happens at board meetings is the mission, which in that case is the business, gets this big, and the community is this big, and then we take spiritual growth and kind of tack it on as that little devotion at the beginning. And I think you just have to think about the balance. And so for a retreat, even if it's just at the church for a Saturday morning or a Sunday afternoon, make the spiritual growth circle is going to be this big, and the community circle is going to be this big, and the business meeting, the mission of the board is going to be this big. So you have to build it in intentionally. The PEC last year or 2 years ago studied a book together, and so every meeting we started off with going through a chapter of a book and talking about it, or having an extended prayer time, or there are some excellent devotional materials for board leaders. I know the Lutheran Church published some things a few years ago that were very helpful, but I guess the thing is, one of the comments I had in this category, Brenda, was, I thought it was going to be a waste of time to do the 20-minute Bible study And it turns out we got more done in the rest of the meeting than I ever thought we would, because we did pause and take time for that Bible study. So it's hard to recommend a percentage, but I would say every meeting needs to have a spiritual growth, discipleship, sharing component to it. And sometimes it can be for a good long while. So, yeah. So, great closing question, I think. So. Well, Marie, final words before we maybe I'll offer a brief closing prayer, and we'll send everybody out into their evenings or afternoons, depending on where they are. I guess it's all by evening now, isn't it? So anyway, Marie.
Really glad to have been a part of this. It's been wonderful working with David. I think it's the first time we've been together at synods, but this is the first time we've worked on a project together, and that has been fun. And really delighted to see the number of people. And again, as David has shared, we both have resources that we'd be more than happy to share on a topic. And so feel free to call me or email me at any time.
Yeah. Well, let's close our time together with a prayer. Let us pray. Lord Jesus Christ, we thank you that you are head and chief shepherd of the church, and certainly the chief elder of our Moravian church. And through the centuries, you have raised up pastors and leaders to fulfill your mission, your purpose for us as a community of faith. Gracious God, I thank you for the leaders that have assembled tonight in this meeting. And I ask that you continue to provide them strength and courage and energy and insight for the tasks to which you call them. Bless them so that they can be blessings to others, and your name will grow in the knowledge of all people, and your kingdom will advance. And we lift these things up to you in your most precious name. Amen.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Marie. A reminder that paid restraint registrants will receive an email. Let me try getting this right. I will receive an email within 2 weeks of the end of Leadership Focus that will contain a recording of this and other Leadership Focus workshops, as well as other helpful resources and materials. You can find additional Leadership Focus workshop information on moravianbcm.org.